Good to see that you came back for more of this not very exciting subject. So this is the third video series on significant figures. My integrated kids will know this as topic 3C, and what we will be discussing in this is taking a number with lots of significant figures and rounding it down to a smaller number of significant figures. It's kind of one of the things that you'll need to do to be able to successfully complete the skill on the last of this video series. So we got to do this before we can do the last part. So skip ahead past all the stuff that we've already done and come to rounding with significant figures. And we're going to need this, like I said, because these rules you will use when we're doing maths with significant figures, which is kind of like the take-home end goal of this series so that you can do lab reports and do math with them and report the math with correct sig figs. So what's going to happen is you're going to be taking values that you did in math, multiplying and dividing them, doing some calculation, and your calculator is probably going to return a very, very large number with lots of significant figures. It's going to have some inexact decimal, and we don't always just get to use the value that our calculator showed because it's probably going to have more significant figures than we can honestly report because it's indicating more precision than we have. So we're going to look at first rounding to the left of the decimal. And when you round to the left of the decimal, we're going to be dropping off the extra digits that we have that we don't want to be significant, but the key thing is we're going to round those things that we dropped to placeholder zeros because we still need to keep our value the same size. So let's say I did a calculation in a lab and my calculator returned this. Right now this has, you can follow the rules, there aren't any zeros in it, so everything is significant. This number as it's written has 6 significant figures, and we're going to practice rounding it down to a lower number of significant figures, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So when I'm rounding it to a lower number of significant figures, I'm going to look at the very first one. In this case, it's a 1. So that's the significant figure that I'm going to keep. That happens to be in the thousands place. Now I am going to check 1 past it here in the hundreds place just to see when I round, am I going to round up or down? 5 tells me to round up. So I'm keeping 1 significant figure in the thousands place, and I'm going to round that 1 up to a 2. So 1 sig fig, my 1 sig fig becomes a 2. Now 2 has the correct number of significant figures that we're looking for in this example, 1, but do you think 2 is a very good estimate of the original number, which was 1,561.81? No, and that's because it's much, much too small. We need placeholder zeros. And I need 3 placeholder zeros to keep that number in the thousands place. Now what some students will do, they know to convert to placeholders. They will write 2,000 and they will do that for the 2 numbers after it. And this is not correct because if you go back to the previous video on the rules, if there's a decimal present, all zeros except zeros in the front of the number count as significant. So these would not be regarded as placeholder zeros if there's a decimal present. So that would still have 6 significant figures. So that is not what we want. So anyway, moving on to 2 significant figures. 2 sig figs. Let's make that black. 2 significant figures. So I'm going to be keeping now the thousands place and the hundreds place. Those are the ones I want to keep, the 1 and the 5, and I'm going to look past it to the 6, the third significant figure. I'm not going to keep that one, but it's going to inform my rounding, and again, 6 is going to make my 5 round up. So now my 2 significant figures are going to be 1, 6. And again, 16 is not very close to 1561.81, so I need placeholder zeros. And I'm just going to add those two placeholder zeros that take me to where the decimal was. I'm not going to put the decimal on. I'm not going to put any of the stuff after the decimal. That's just going to get chopped off. So let's do one more here. 3 significant figures. 3 sig figs. And so my 3 sig figs are the 1, the 5, and the 6. I'm going to look at the 4th one, not going to keep it, but it informs the rounding of the one that I am going to keep. 1 does not round up, so I'm going to have 1, 5, 6, and just one placeholder 0. Okay, so when you're looking at rounding to the left of the decimal, you're going to replace the numbers that you round away with placeholders, but only until you get to the position where the decimal was. Everything after the decimal is just going to get dropped off. And let's finish this up. 4 sig figs. In this case, I'm going to be keeping the 1, 5, 6, 1, and I'm going to use the 5th one, this 8 in the 10th place to inform my rounding of the 1, and that rounds up. So 4 significant figures is going to be 1, 5, 6, 2. You could put the decimal or you could not put the decimal because it doesn't matter in this case because this isn't a 0, so the presence of the decimal doesn't change the fact that this 2 is always going to be significant. If that were a 0 there, if we needed to take a number that rounded like this and make it have 4 zeros, we could pop that decimal on there, and that would indicate that that 0 is not a placeholder but is significant if it rounded differently. Now let's look at rounding to the right of the decimal. It's a little bit simpler because we don't have to worry about converting numbers to placeholders. All we're going to do is find where we end with our significant figures, do our rounding, and then chop everything off. So as an example, I've got a number here. You might recognize it as pi, and we're going to round it to 2, 3, 4, and 5 significant figures. So for 2 sig figs, I'm going to look at the 3 and the 1. Those are my first 2 significant figures. I'm going to check the 4 to see how to round the 1. We don't round it up, so 2 significant figures, that's going to be 3.1. 3 significant figures, I'm going to look at the 3, the 1, and the 4, and I'm going to check the one after the 4 that tells me don't round up, so 3.14 is 3 significant figures. 4 significant figures. I want to go 1, 2, 3, 4, so that's to this 1. I check with the 5 and it tells me to round the 1 up, so 4 significant figures is going to be 3.142. And lastly, 5 significant figures. I'm going to look at the 3, 1, 4, 1, 5 and check with the 9 to tell me how to round the 5, and it rounds up, so that will become 3.1416. Let me throw one more example at you. Here, let's move this away. And I'm just going to make up a number here. All right, there's a number, and let's say we need to round this number to 2 significant figures. Okay. Now the trick with this is to notice that we do have a decimal, so our rule tells us when there's a decimal, zeros in the front of the number are placeholders, so these are not significant. So I'm not going to look at this is 1 significant figure, this is the 2nd significant figure, 0 doesn't round up, my answer rounds to 0 with 2 significant figures. No, these are just placeholders. My first 2 significant figures are this 3 and this 2. And I would consult with the 9, that tells me to round my 2 up to a 3. So with 2 significant figures, there's my placeholder zeros, I'm just putting them in there, not counting them. And then my 2 significant figures where I rounded the 2 up. Let's do one more here. 3 significant figures. So 3 significant figures, I'm going to ignore those. 1, 2, 3. The 9 is my third significant figure. The 5 informs me to round the 9 up. Tricky. So putting my placeholders in. When I round up a 9, it rounds up to a 10. And so that means I need to carry the 1 over to the 2. So with 3 significant figures, that is your correct answer. 3 placeholder zeros, 1, 2, 3 significant figures, because this is my third significant figure, because if there's a decimal, placeholders are at the front, zeros at the end of the number count when there's a decimal. So that still lets me round correctly and get my 3 significant figures, but that's tricky. Be careful on that one if you're rounding 9s up and need it to show as a significant figure. So that ends this video segment. We've got one more of these if you're an Integrated 2 student, and 2 more if you are a chemistry student. So hang in there, we are almost done. And that's where we're going to stop with this video, because this is getting into the rules for significant figures. I am going to skip ahead and look at some of the exact. No, I'm not.